physical therapy is largely becoming the property of neurophysiology. We certainly don't have to look far to find evidence of. We look to studies examining EMG activation patterns of muscle, examining feedback and feed-forward motor planning paradigms, and more recently looking at motor control pathways through the use of functional MRI and that sort of thing, to understand that in order to be effective at orthopedic physical therapy, we really do need to understand muscle and nerve physiology. Some of what we'll talk about today will be review for some of you, particularly those of you who've recently graduated. For some others, this either might be new or will be a refresher of things you've learned some time ago. There will also be some new information, I should think, for all of you. We're going to look at this idea of myokinetics and myokinematics from a very mechanistic standpoint, to try and understand the underlying processes behind what we do and how we might be able to affect them. So I think before we begin, it's worthwhile drawing a distinction between kinematics and kinetics. These are terms that get thrown around rather frequently. We talk about arthrokinematics, osteokinematics. Now we're going to talk about myokinematics and kinetics. To put this very, very simply, this is the way that I remember the difference between these two terms, and some of you may think it's silly, and that's just fine. But kinematics is a longer word that deals with fewer things. So when we talk about kinematics, we're essentially talking about the motion of an object, and this is why we often talk about osteokinematics, arthrokinematics. We can talk about the movement of a bone in space. We can talk about the movement of a bone in a particular plane. Okay, we're not talking about the forces that cause that movement. We're really just describing the movement. When we're talking about kinetics, we are now talking about forces that cause movement. So, as an example of what we're going to talk about today, I will use a term of resting length to describe the position a muscle would take if essentially extracted from the body and just laid on a table. We could talk about that in a way. We can talk about it myokinematically, where we've removed all external forces. We can talk about the length of the muscle. We could also talk about what would happen if we took that muscle and stimulated it. It would shorten. We could also consider that to be a myokinematic term. On the other hand, I'm also going to use the term resting position to talk about the position a joint takes when all of the muscles around that joint are at rest. In this case, this is a kinetic term. The resting position a joint takes is dependent on the tone of the muscles on either side of that joint, as well as gravity and the body's orientation to gravity. So hopefully that will help you with understanding the difference between these terms. And of course, when we talk about myo, we're dealing with muscle. It's worthwhile starting with an understanding of the very basic contractile unit of a muscle. And again, this will probably be a review for a number of you, and I don't feel like I need to go too in-depth here. We can look at the sarcomere as the basic contractile unit of a muscle. The sarcomere primarily made up of thin actin filaments, which are connected to a Z disc, as well as the thicker myosin filaments, which we think of as sort of free-floating, although they're not really. They're in fact all connected end-to-end with a very springy molecule known as titin. The myosin filaments have these hinged heads to them, which will connect with binding sites on the actin filaments when the situations are right. And this, of course, is how we get the power stroke, which leads to a contraction of a sarcomere. If we look at the actin filaments more closely, there are two molecules that are worthwhile mentioning. Those are troponin and tropomyosin. The tropomyosin is a rather large continuous protein which at rest covers the binding sites for the myosin heads. The binding sites in this picture are indicated by small black circles. The troponin is the regulator molecule. It's the lock, if you will, waiting for the proper key to come around and unlock the door. Troponin has a binding site for calcium, and when calcium binds to troponin, this leads to tropomyosin moving out of the way and thus exposing the binding sites for the for the myosin heads. We remember that myosin is, if you will, always energized. As long as ATP is present, it's just waiting for an actin binding site to become available. I think about it like a dog who's waiting for you to throw its toy. And the dog's saying, come on, throw the toy, throw the toy, throw the toy, throw the toy. And as soon as you throw that toy, boom, the dog's gone. And this is what the myosin heads are doing. They're essentially waiting. They're energized. Show me that site, show me that site, show me that site. And as soon as you show it, boom, we get a power stroke. This is an example of the power stroke. Very much like rowers rowing a boat. As all the oars move in one direction, the boat moves in the opposite direction. As we continue to build muscle, we start to look at some of the connective tissue in around the muscle. Starting from the bottom right-hand corner of this page, we see a number of sarcomeres put together and bundled all together to form a myofibril. When we bundle myofibrils together and stick some mitochondria in there, which allow for ATP generation, we wrap it all up in a sarcolemma. This, if you will, is the powerhouse of the muscle cell. Then we add a nucleus and wrap that with endomysium, which is a connective tissue. I think it's worthwhile remembering the connective tissue of muscle because muscle do have passive properties as well as active properties. We then take a full muscle cell, put it together with some capillaries and other muscle cells to form a fasciculus, and that gets wrapped in perimysium, another connective tissue. We put a number of fasciculi together, wrap it in epimysium, and we have a muscle. If we want to talk about the kinetics of muscular contraction, we can't really do that without talking about excitation-contraction coupling. This is a graphic demonstration of that, starting from the muscle fiber surface. So we've assumed that we understand that the action potential has been propagated probably from some area of the motor cortex, the cerebellum, down the spinal cord, synapsed at the level of the alpha motor neuron, and then has traveled out to the periphery. At the periphery, the alpha motor neuron synapses with a muscle at the neuromuscular junction. There is what's called a motor end plate directly underneath that axon, which receives the neurotransmitter, in this case usually acetylcholine, as it transmits across the synapse. Assuming enough of the excitatory neurotransmitter is transmitted across the synapse, then we get depolarization of the muscle fiber membrane. Remember, muscle fiber membranes are excitable themselves. They're not just passive tissues. Once that depolarization occurs, the action potential spreads out across the membrane of the muscle fiber until it reaches an entrance into the muscle called a T-tubule. T-tubules run vertically or perpendicular to the muscle fiber membrane. The action potential then travels down into the muscle, and at the end of the T-tubule, it stimulates the sarcoplasmic reticulum. The sarcoplasmic reticulum contains a lot of calcium. When it gets stimulated, it releases that calcium into the muscle fiber, and of course that will then connect with the troponin, and as we talked about, will lead to a power stroke. There also needs to be ATP in the area, not only to cause the power stroke, but to also break that power stroke and to re-energize the myosin heads in preparation for the next burst of action potentials down the muscle. The power stroke will continue, however, until the calcium is removed from the troponin, and this is occurred by the action of enzymes. From here, we're going to talk now about properties of muscle using the length-tension relationship. Again, some of this is going to be review. Some of this might be new. I want you to examine or imagine an experiment with, we'll start with two blocks facing each other, and we'll add a hook to either one of those blocks. Between those two hooks, we'll stretch a muscle. We'll add a strain gauge on one of those blocks with a little dial that tells us how much tension is produced in that muscle. And then finally, we'll stick a stimulator on the muscle. This is very close to the type of experiments that were done to initially give us the length-tension relationship by a fellow named Hans Blix. He took the muscle starting at resting length, caused a muscle contraction, and examined how much tension was developed. Then took those blocks and moved them either away from each other or towards each other. And again, continued to stimulate the muscle and see how much tension generated. This is the result of that work. Length of L, which says L0, or essentially L prime, is resting length, and that's the length shown directly in the center of this image. You can see that at rest, the tissue produces no tension. The muscle is stimulated and causes a twitch. As we start to move away from that in either direction, so as we start to move away from resting length, either towards a more lengthened or a more shortened position, the tension that can be generated changes. As we move towards the shortened position, we start to see less and less tension generated, although we still at rest are at 0. As we move towards a more lengthened position, we again see less and less active tension generated, but as we continue to lengthen this muscle, at rest we already have a certain degree of passive tension generated. So as we move towards a lengthened position, while the active tension that we can generate decreases, the passive tension increases, and oftentimes the total tension remains fairly similar throughout the change in length. So we can take that information and graph it to give us the active length-tension relationship. There are 4 arms to these relationships. At arm A and before that, so starting from the left, we have what's called the steep ascending limb. This is the situation where the muscle is in its shortened position. In a shortened position, what's happening here is the actin filaments are overlapping each other from either side, and thereby covering some of those binding sites that would normally be available to the myosin heads. In the steep ascending arm, the reason we see such a quick steep drop-off is in fact that the actin filaments from either side start to bump into the Z discs on the opposite side. So in fact the muscle can't contract very far. Between A and B we call this the shallow ascending limb. Here again we have less active tension generated, not because the actin filaments are bumping into each other, but because they're overlapping, and we have fewer myosin binding sites available. Between B and C, this is called the plateau region. This is often referred to as optimal length for the muscle. Although, as we're going to see here shortly, optimal length is slightly longer than resting length. In this situation, all of the actin binding sites are available to the myosin heads, and so the maximum amount of tension can be generated. Between C and D, this is called the descending limb. Here we continue to lengthen the sarcomere. And now, as we lengthen this, the binding sites sort of on the extremes of the actin filaments become unavailable to the myosin heads, and as we continue to lengthen, fewer and fewer binding sites are available, and as such we can't produce as much force. We'll keep in mind that muscles have adapted over time based on their function, and they each have their own length tension curves. So for example, if we look at a pennate muscle, the gastrocnemius is a good example of that. These muscles are really built for power and speed over short distances. The gastrocnemius really needs to work essentially from a position of knee flexion and full ankle plantar flexion through to a position of knee extension and full ankle dorsiflexion, which really, when you think about it, is not a large excursion for that muscle. The muscle doesn't really need to lengthen all that far. And as such, it develops a lot of tension, but over a relatively short length excursion. So we can shorten that tissue fairly easily, and we won't get a whole lot of tension developed. If we take a look at a fusiform muscle, this is a muscle where all the fibers run parallel, and the tendons are at either end of the muscle, as opposed to the central tendon, which is in a pennate muscle. Fusiform muscles are really designed to generate usable force or usable tension over a fairly large range. So I've used the biceps brachii as an example. The biceps brachii has to generate effective force from a position of essentially full shoulder extension, full elbow extension, and full forearm pronation, all the way through to position of full shoulder flexion, full elbow flexion, and full forearm supination, which is a fairly long excursion. So its length tension curve is quite a bit more smooth. We also don't want to forget about the passive properties of the muscles, and I did show you the connective tissues in the muscle. So those were the endomysium, the perimysium, and the epimysium. These all contribute to the tension ability of a muscle. And it's worthwhile talking about the passive stress-strain curves. We often look at these thinking about passive tissues such as ligament, tendon, cartilage, this sort of thing, but we don't forget that muscles do have their own passive stress-strain curves. Just to draw your attention to some particularly interesting areas, the area before the A shown on the curve, this has been largely come to be called the neutral zone anymore. This is where the muscle starts to lengthen, as shown by an increase in strain. Strain, by the way, is essentially usually expressed as a percentage of new length over resting length. So it's really an indicator of lengthening. However, we don't get an increase in stress. In other words, we get really no resistance to the movement. Okay, so we've called this the neutral zone. As we continue to stretch this muscle, it gets longer, but we do now get tension developed. Within normal physiological range, this occurs in the elastic zone. In other words, as the muscle lengthens, we don't tear anything. We are using the elastic properties of the muscle to store potential energy, which can then be converted to kinetic energy when the muscles relax and everything returns back to its resting position. There's no permanent change in length as a result of lengthening in the elastic zone. If we were to go beyond the elastic zone, we'd enter the plastic zone. In the plastic zone, we do start to see some microfiber damage, and in fact, there will be a permanent change in length as a result of the stress that we've applied. When we release the stress on a tissue that's been taken to the plastic zone, it will not return to its original resting length. In D, this is the mass failure area. This is where we're starting to see microfiber damage. And then in E, essentially the tissue is completely torn. We don't want to forget that just like our passive tissues, active tissue, muscle do possess viscoelastic properties. Viscoelastic properties are things like creep, for example. Creep is a property of a viscous tissue. As well as I already mentioned, elastic properties, so the muscle can essentially regain all of its stored potential energy through kinetic energy to help us return to a neutral position. Also, the rate of elongation, so in other words, the rate with which we stretch a muscle is independent of the rate with which we apply the stress. So, in other words, the faster you try to stretch a viscoelastic tissue, the more it will resist your stretch. Very similar to a hydraulic door, for example. The door is going to close at a given rate, no matter how hard you push on that door, it's still going to close at that rate. So the harder you push, the more it pushes back against you. So this is the same way in muscle tissue. This is an example of creep, just to remember or to remind ourselves. As we take a tissue and lengthen it to an area within the elastic zone, and we hold it at that length, so we don't continue to add any more stress. We just hold it at a given strain. Over time, the tissue will lengthen. Once again, this is a property of a viscous tissue. When we release the stress, the tissue will return slowly back to its original length, although not immediately. There are two reasons for this. One is that the tissue does not shorten in the same way that it lengthened. Okay, it shortens back down to a zero stress position fairly quickly. This is known as a hysteresis, for you thinking back to your chemistry days, where the rate of one reaction does not mirror the reverse of that same reaction. And then when the tissue returns to a point of zero stress, it will oftentimes be in a longer position than what its original resting position was. We call this the new set length. If we continue to maintain that length, so for example, if we do functional exercises in our new length, then over time that muscle will take on that new length as its resting length. So now we're going to combine these two curves, the active and the passive length tension curve, and examine the total tension curve and figure out what that tells us and how we can use that. So here I've drawn the the stress-strain curve for a muscle, starting from resting position indicated by the dashed line here. If we then add, I love those sound effects. This is obviously a slide I made back in the days when I was first learning PowerPoint. If we put tension along the y-axis and percent of resting length, in other words, strain along the x-axis, then we know where we're coming from here. So we've got our passive tension curve, and there is the active tension curve superimposed on top of that. Again, you see that right around resting length is where we get the plateau region of the active tension curve, and that's of course where we start to see passive tension as we continue to elongate from there. When we try and summate the two curves, we get this idea that total tension, of course, is a summation of active and passive tension, and more often than not, total tension is greatest at a point just beyond resting length. Oftentimes it's about 10% or so of beyond resting length. So here, if we look at the sum of active tension and passive tension, even though we're at the point where we're starting to decrease the active tension a little bit, we're sort of just at the top of that descending slope, because passive tension is increasing, the total tension is in fact highest here. In this particular example, optimal length of a muscle, and when I'm talking optimal length, I'm defining this as the point where total tension is the greatest, is, like we said here, about 10% beyond resting length. This is a position where we often will do heavy work. We'll do heavy work in our optimal length because we can use both the passive and active properties of our tissue. And we don't want to forget that sometimes we need to rehabilitate those passive properties of muscle tissue. I'm going to just quickly throw this up, not spend too much time on the force-velocity relationship. I think the interesting thing here, the things to note, when we look at this, first of all, to orient ourselves to this relationship, zero velocity, zero contraction velocity, in other words, an isometric contraction, is shown by the dotted line there. As we move to the right of that dotted line, we are getting a shortening of a muscle, in which case we've got, of course, concentric contraction. Towards the left side of the dashed line, we have eccentric contractions, where we've got negative shortening velocity. In other words, we've got a lengthening. The take-home messages here, first of all, the more force that you have to produce, the slower your muscle can contract. Take that in the opposite. The faster your muscle is contracting, the less force you can produce. This is really due to the mechanics of muscular contraction. It takes time for all of those myosin heads to connect with the actin. It takes time for all of the alpha motor neurons, the motor units, to be recruited. So again, the faster you go, the less force you can produce. On the opposite side of that dashed line is the eccentric contraction. The interesting thing there is that a maximal eccentric contraction can in fact produce more force than a maximum isometric contraction. This is because, well, we're not entirely sure why this is, but we think this is because it takes more force to break a cross bridge, to break the myosin and actin connection, than it does than what those cross bridges can produce on their own. Okay, so as we're lengthening a tissue, we are essentially involuntarily breaking those cross bridges. And in fact, the act of breaking those cross bridges requires more force than what those cross bridges could produce on their own in an isometric contraction. So again, we could look at this and think, well, maybe in the case of a really weak muscle, it's worthwhile starting with eccentric exercise before we progress to concentric exercise, because we can probably take the muscle through a greater range of motion. We can get more functional strengthening throughout range with an eccentric exercise than we could a concentric exercise in the case of a weak muscle. Caution, of course, there. Anyone who has lifted weights or anyone who goes and takes up an activity after a period of inactivity knows it's the eccentric component that leads to that delayed onset muscle soreness. We are involuntarily breaking a normal physiologic process. We're going to cause some inflammation. People sometimes aren't terribly keen on that pain, that delayed onset muscle soreness you get the next day. So now I want to talk about lever arms and relate this to length tension curves and how we're using this in developing good exercises for our patients. A couple of definitions. First of all, when we're talking about lever arms, we need to understand first effort force. I'm going to use the term effort force to describe the force produced by a muscle. And I'm going to use the term resistance force to describe the force produced by the resistance, which oftentimes will either be gravity or some kind of resisted object, a hand weight or a TheraBand, a rubber band, whatever the case may be. In the case of gravity, of course, the direction of the resistance force is always going to be straight down towards the floor. We can change the direction of resistance force by using pulleys, cables, again, elastic resistance, this sort of thing. But if we're just talking gravity, it's always down towards the floor. And when we talk about mechanical advantage, we're going to talk about this as it pertains to the different classes of levers. Mechanical advantage, if you will, is really just a ratio of effort torque to resistance torque. A mechanical advantage of 1 signifies that you have no particular added advantage given the lever that you're using. So if you can produce X amount of force, you get no added advantage, you get no extra force, you get no multiplier to that force if your lever has a mechanical advantage of 1. If your mechanical advantage is greater than 1, then you only have to produce a fraction of the force necessary to move the resistance, because you actually, in essence, you multiply your force by your mechanical advantage to give yourself your torque. On the other hand, if the mechanical advantage is less than 1, then you have to produce more force than what it would normally take if you were to just lift up the resistance, straight from the ground. Okay. This is because the force that you produce is, in fact, it's multiplied by a number less than 1. So you actually end up losing force in a lever that gives you a mechanical advantage of less than 1. So let me clarify this then. In a Class 1 lever is one where you've got your axis lying in between your effort and your resistance. A Class 1 lever can have a mechanical advantage of either 1, of either less than 1, or of greater than 1. And this depends on the distance away from the axis that the effort force and the resistance force lie. If the effort force lies farther away from the axis than what the resistance force does, then you've got a mechanical advantage greater than 1. For example, think about this. If the effort force and the resistance force were precisely the same, but the effort force lied farther away from the axis than what the resistance force did, then the torque developed by the effort force, and torque is a function of force multiplied by the distance away from the axis. So the torque developed by the effort force, in fact, will be greater than the torque developed by the resistance force, despite the fact that two forces are the same, simply by virtue of how far away they are from the axis. In a Class 2 lever, you've got your axis, your resistance force, and then your effort force. Your effort force is always further away from the axis than the resistance force is. So the torque you develop, in the case of having both forces being exactly the same, the torque you develop will always be greater with the effort than what the resistance will be. So you always have a mechanical advantage greater than 1 with a second class lever. In a third class lever, the effort force is always closer to the axis than what the resistance force is. In this case, your mechanical advantage will always be less than 1. So you will always be working at a mechanical disadvantage to try and move your resistance. In the body, most of our levers are Class 3 levers. There are a few examples of Class 1 and 2 that you can find. A Class 1 lever could be looked at the atlanto-occipital joint. If you look at the axis of motion occurring right in the middle of that motion segment, right in the middle of the atlas, the center of mass of the skull lies just anterior to that axis, which is considered the resistance force, and the muscle force or the effort force that is trying to not let your skull just fall forward would be your suboccipital muscles, which lie posterior to that axis of rotation. So here we've got a Class 1 lever. The axis lies in between the effort and the resistance. Class 2 lever, we're looking at the foot in a closed kinetic chain, and this really only works in a closed kinetic chain. In this case, if the foot is going up on your tiptoes, for example, the axis of rotation would be the metatarsal heads. Lying just behind that, and this really assumes that your body's in the right orientation here, but lying just behind that would be the center of mass of your body weight. In this case, this is the resistance force. The effort force would be your triceps suri group, the Achilles tendon producing that force, and that would lie further away from the axis than what the resistance force would. So this is an example of a Class 2 lever, probably one of the only examples we're going to come up with in the body. Class 3 levers, of course, like I said, they're the most common, they're easy to come up with. Almost all muscles in our body work on a Class 3 system. So this is an example of the biceps brachii once again. The axis of rotation here is the elbow. The effort force is the biceps. And the resistance force, well, in this case, the individual is holding a weight in their hand, so that's where the resistance force is going to be. If the individual was not holding a weight in their hand, the resistance force would be the center of mass of the forearm. For most people, that's about midpoint, depending on the size of your hands and the mass of the muscle mass in your forearms. This is a Class 3 lever. I already mentioned torque, and when we're talking about movement around a joint, really we should be talking about torque more so than force. The force is what's leading to the torque, but it's the torque that causes this circular motion around an axis. I'm also going to use the term moment arm, and really with there I'm referring to the perpendicular distance between the axis of rotation and the point of application of the force. So there's going to be an effort moment arm, there's going to be a resistance moment arm, and those again are that's the perpendicular distance away from the axis of rotation that either the effort or the resistance force is applied to the bone. In this case, the bone is going to be our lever. This will become clearer here in a moment. So here we go. Let's clarify that. Here again, I've got just a diagrammatic representation of an elbow. I've got so I guess this looks more like brachialis. The axis of rotation here is the elbow. The effort force is then going to come from the brachialis. I'm showing a green arrow as showing the effort force in a vertical direction. Now, because the brachialis comes off at an angle, there is also a force which would go back towards the axis of rotation. Okay, this is taking us now back to high school physics. Here, we can resolve the vectors and figure out what direction things are going to move. But I'm mostly interested in the vertical force here. So the brachialis produces a vertical force pulling straight upwards. In this case, I've put a big red circle to denote a weight being held in the hand, and that's going to be our resistance force. So when I talk about moment arms, the effort arm is the distance between the axis of rotation and the point of application of that vertical force. The resistance arm, of course, is the same thing to the point of application of that vertical force of the weight. We know this is a third-class lever, so the effort arm is shorter than the resistance arm. How do we get movement here? Well, if the torque produced by the effort is greater than the torque produced by the resistance, you're going to get motion in a shortening position. You're going to start to flex the elbow. On the other hand, if the torque produced by the resistance is greater than the torque produced by the muscle, then you're going to get a lengthening. You're going to get the elbow is going to move towards a point of extension. Now we can start to talk about what happens as the elbow moves away from a 90-degree flex position. In number 2, we see the elbow extending, and in number 3, we see the elbow flexing. In both those positions, the effort arm and the resistance arm get shorter. This is because the way I define moment arm is being the perpendicular distance from the axis of rotation to the point of application of force. The insertion of the muscle, of course, hasn't changed, but the fact that the insertion is getting closer to the axis, when we're looking at it perpendicularly, those arms are getting smaller. Now, this isn't necessarily a bad situation. If we were, crane, for example, I'm not talking about the bird, I'm talking about the piece of construction equipment, this wouldn't necessarily be bad, because the resistance arm and the effort arm are both decreasing at the same rate. But we aren't cranes. Our muscles produce less force as we move away from that resting position. Now, in number 2, to be honest with you, this is probably closer to resting position than what number 1 is for brachialis. So in fact, this still isn't a bad situation. We're still fairly strong in that position of, say, roughly 30 to 45 degrees of elbow flexion. In number 3, where our elbows are moving beyond 90 degrees of flexion, the muscle is shortening, the effort arm is getting smaller, we really can produce much less torque in those positions. Now, the reason I put number 4 in there is just sort of for a point of interest. You might ask yourself, why have we developed in such a way, if effort arms are very important, why have we evolved in such a way as to have all of our muscles close to the axis of rotation? I mean, if we were to take our brachialis and have it inserted halfway down our forearm, we would have a much longer effort arm. We'd be able to produce much more torque. And indeed, that's the case, but really it's a matter of movement efficiency. In the case of number 1, a small change in the length of that muscle, that brachialis, will lead to a significant change in the position of the elbow. On the other hand, at number 4, that same small change in brachialis really wouldn't lead to a whole lot of change in the elbow position. So just think about how much that muscle would have to be able to lengthen and to shorten if we had it popped out there in the middle of the forearm. So it's really become a more efficient way of moving to have our muscles inserted very close to our axis of rotation. Before I leave this slide, I'll also mention one more term, and that is optimal joint position. I've used the term optimal length, and I describe that as being that length where total tension is the highest, where the summation of active and passive tension is the greatest. Optimal joint position takes one more piece into account, and that is the effort arm. So optimal joint position is that position really where you can produce the most torque. You can produce the most torque where your muscles are at an optimal or near optimal length, and where the effort arm is the greatest. So for the elbow, in fact, our optimal position is about 90 degrees of elbow flexion, probably just slightly under that, somewhere in the 80 to 85 degree point. Different muscles have different, or different joints will have different positions for optimal force. So that's just something to think about as well. And again, that's a myokinetic term, optimal joint position. So I just want to talk now about how we can actually use this stuff clinically. We want to understand how we can develop a good exercise for our patient to help them get effective strengthening throughout the entire range of motion of a muscle. Of course, this means that the resistance needs to change at the same time as our tension changes. So the resistance needs to get less as our muscle shortens, for example. So we do remember that muscles produce less force than shortened, and they produce less active force when lengthened, although the total tension is oftentimes the same. So a good exercise must really account for this. It must account for the force generating capacity of a muscle as well as the length of the lever arm. I mentioned this little piece here I put, is isotonic exercise really isotonic? And that I'll show you what I mean here with this slide. I've got two exercises here, both similar motions. The top exercise is a reverse, often called reverse fly. The person is bent over, holds two weights in the hand, and raises them out to the side. This is essentially horizontal abduction. In this case, this is a bad match between the tension generating capacity of a muscle and the resistance arms. When this person is in starting position, the image on the left, the top left, the muscles that are producing this force, so the rhomboids, for example, the posterior delts, that sort of thing, they're in a pretty good position. Okay, they're a little bit lengthened. Okay, they're certainly not in a fully lengthened position. They're a little bit lengthened. They can produce some good force. However, the resistance arm is essentially zero. If the axis of rotation is the shoulders, the resistance is what the weight's being held in the hand. And again, I talk about the moment arm as being the perpendicular distance between those two things. Well, if I was to extend a line straight up through the axis of rotation, it would hit the resistance. So here, the resistance arm essentially is zero. As she moves to the end position, which is the picture on the right, what's happened here? Now the resistance arm has gotten huge. Okay, you look at the distance between the axis of rotation and the weight in her hand, and that resistance arm is gigantic. Unfortunately, the force producing capacity of the muscles now is much, much smaller. So this is an exercise that really only gives you any kind of decent strengthening at that very far end position, and that's only with your muscles in a shortened position. This exercise on a whole is not a good match between the length-tension relationship of the muscle and the resistance arm. It will allow some strengthening, but it won't allow effective strengthening throughout range. She's getting absolutely no strengthening in that start position. When we look at the picture underneath here of a pec fly, now the person is lying face up. In starting position, the arms are out to the side, holding two weights in the hand. There's a large resistance arm here. Again, the axis of rotation is through the shoulder. So the resistance arm is large, but the force-producing capacity of the muscles is also fairly large. So you think about the pecs here. They're in a nice position. They're a little bit lengthened beyond rest. They're able to produce a good amount of force. As we shorten the pecs in the end position in the picture to the right, the pecs can now not produce as much force, but that's okay because the resistance arm has gone to essentially zero. So this is a kind of exercise from a free weight perspective that really does provide effective strengthening throughout range. So you can start to think about how you can play with some of those in your clinic, how you can play with pulleys and elastic resistance, and start to try and match some of these things to allow your patients good functional strengthening throughout range. Okay, I'm going to switch gears now. We're going to talk about muscle spindles and Golgi tendon organs. I am going to try and go through this reasonably quickly because I hope this is a review. We'll see how we do here. So we're going to talk about the types of afferent feedback we get from muscles. We'll talk about spindles, Golgi tendon organs, and free nerve endings. Here's a muscle spindle. A couple of terms just to hopefully remind ourselves of. The muscle spindles are within a capsule. The fibers inside that capsule, which are called intrafusal fibers, lie in parallel with the rest of the muscle fibers, and the rest of the muscle fibers are called extrafusal fibers. The spindles can either be a nuclear bag fiber or a nuclear chain fiber, and we're going to talk about the difference between those in a moment. The afferent endings wrap around these intrafusal fibers in sort of a spiral. They're often called spiral endings. The Golgi tendon organ is shown at the bottom of this image here. The Golgi tendon organ is oftentimes said to lie in series between the muscle and the tendon. The types of fibers we get our 1A primary spindle afferents and group 2 secondary spindle afferents. These two are the afferents that come from our muscles. They are excitatory to the alpha motor neuron of the same muscle. The 1B afferent comes from the Golgi tendon organ. These afferents are going to work in an inhibitory reflex loop with the motor neuron of the same muscle. The group 3 and 4 nerve endings are oftentimes found sort of throughout muscle and other tissues. These are chemosensitive. Some of them are thermosensitive, although not many of them are thermosensitive in the muscles. And essentially, if you will, they code for, we've got the word pain here, but really what they do is they code for damage. Okay, inflammation. Pain, of course, is a multidimensional construct that is a whole other story. Don't get me started. To look at the stretch reflex, this is essentially a muscle spindle mediated reflex. If you take a muscle that's at a particular length, it's at that length because that's the length that the brain has told it to be at. The brain receives constant feedback, constant input from our muscles to make sure that they're at the length that we want them to be at. If you take that muscle and lengthen it quickly and unexpectedly, and when I say unexpectedly, I mean the brain didn't tell it to do that. Okay, we lengthen it sort of externally. So this is where we take our reflex hammer, we tap a tendon. By tapping the tendon, the muscle lengthens. As the muscle lengthens, the intrafusal muscle spindle fibers also lengthen. If they lengthen, they send information back to the spinal cord, back to the alpha motor neuron, which then says, "Oh, we're not supposed to be lengthened. We were hoping to be at this particular set length. Now we're longer than what we were." Everything contract to get back to our original set length, and so you'll see the muscle contract, and we'll get that little muscle jerk. At the same time, we also get an inhibitory loop to the antagonistic muscle, which causes it to relax. This is through the 1A inhibitory interneuron. In this picture, it's shown in black. And so not only do we get the shortening contraction of the muscle, the same muscle that we just lengthened, but we get some inhibition of the antagonistic muscle. And again, that just allows us to return back to our normal resting position. We can talk about the fusiomotor system and the idea of alpha-gamma coactivation and how this helps us to achieve set lengths in our muscle. Again, I'm not going to go too much into this. Perhaps in a future lecture we will. But the intrafusal muscle fibers do themselves contract. They don't contract through the action of alpha motor neurons. The alpha motor neurons are reserved for the large extrafusal fibers, but they contract through the action of gamma motor neurons. And it could be said that gamma motor neurons are really the only things that our brain have to activate in order to get our muscles to move. Because if the gamma motor neurons stimulate those intrafusal muscle fibers to contract, the contractile unit of these fibers is on either end of this spindle, okay, on either end of this bag. So by contracting, they actually stretch out the bag in between the two of them. So if both ends contract, the bag stretches out. When the bag stretches out, it lengthens. That stimulates those 1A afferents to go back to the spinal cord, and we all know what happens there. Again, it stimulates the alpha motor neuron, which then goes to the big extrafusal muscle fibers and causes the entire muscle to shorten or to contract. This is sort of the idea behind alpha-gamma coactivation. Again, I think that's as far as I'm going to go into that right now. This is a couple of images of spindle anatomy. This just reminds us that there are two different types of intrafusal fibers. There are nuclear bag fibers. The nuclear bag fibers are the ones that usually code for the rate of length change. They're the ones that are probably more involved in those monosynaptic spinal reflex loops, because we don't get that same loop if we lengthen the muscle slowly. The nuclear chain fibers are the ones that code for length, code for the new length. So it's not the rate of change, it's the new length. In terms of spindle function here, we'll just look at the linear stretch piece here at the left. If we take a muscle and we lengthen it quickly, then we're going to get rapid discharge of the primary spindle afferents, the 1A afferents, as the muscle is lengthening. But then when it achieves its new length, we see the nuclear chain fibers, those secondary spindle afferents, they increase their rate of firing from the original length to the new length. They've increased their rate. So they are telling the brain, they're giving constant feedback as to the length of the muscle. In the tap and the vibration piece or the release piece, we see that as the muscle shortens again, that there's actually a lack of activity in the 1A afferents, and the secondary spindle afferents decrease their firing to tell the brain that the muscle has shortened again. Okay. I've already talked about the gamma motor system. This is another example of that. The idea in the gamma system, and I guess it's worthwhile mentioning this because we hear this word sort of tossed around from time to time in orthopedics. It maintains the gain, the sensitivity, if you will, of the spindle. So if you look at A, if we've got two muscle fibers, two extrafusal muscle fibers, and a muscle spindle in between. If then in B, the two extrafusal muscle fibers contracted, so they shortened, the spindle would just slacken, and the sensitivity of the spindle to any kind of change in length would be gone. So this is why we get this idea of alpha-gamma coactivation. In C, what we see here is that as the extrafusal muscle fibers contract, the intrafusal muscle fibers, so again, that gamma motor system, those contractile units of a spindle also contract at the same rate, and that keeps the spindle fairly taut as the muscle shortens and lengthens. And this just maintains spindle gain. Golgi tendon organs, I guess I don't think there's a whole lot to say about them. We're fairly certain that they increase their activity in response to high degrees of tension. And they are inhibitory to the alpha motor neuron of the same muscle. The thought being that it's essentially a protective mechanism that prevents us from producing too much tension in our muscles. I guess the one thing that's worth mentioning is I know when I was a student, for the longest time, the theorized mechanism behind hold-relax active stretching techniques, so taken from the PNF realm, was that by contracting the muscle, we get Golgi tendon organ stimulation, which inhibits the same muscle we're trying to stretch. More recently, the evidence suggests that's probably not the case. It's not the Golgi tendon organs that are really mediating that, unless we really push hard, unless the patient pushes an absolutely maximal contraction to the point that if they were to not stop, they would tear their muscle. More often than not, we don't get there. So there are other mechanisms probably involved in that reflex loop, and I don't think we need to get into them right now. The free nerve endings, again, these are your type 3 and type 4 endings, and they're sensitive to chemicals for the most part when you're inside the muscle, although the type 3 fibers do also seem to respond to the intensity of contraction, similar to the way the Golgi tendon organs do. So when we get a lot of mechanical tension, particularly in a joint, it seems that the type 3 afferents are the ones that will fire, and again, they are inhibitory to the alpha motor neurons causing that motion. The type 3 fibers do have a little bit of myelin around them. They do transmit impulses a little bit faster than the type 4 fibers do. The type 4 fibers are essentially unmyelinated. In the pain literature, they're thought to be the ones that lead to that sort of dull, poorly localized, but long-lasting pain following an injury. Increasing the activity of the group 3 and the group 4 afferents is going to decrease the activity of the alpha motor neuron. This isn't only good as a protective function in healthy muscle, but of course is also good to protect injured muscle. And this is one of the reasons why it's extremely difficult to strengthen muscle if it's in pain, because you are working against this protective mechanism. Okay, and this is also probably one of the reasons why muscles tend to atrophy when they're in pain. Okay, they simply don't contract as easily. The larger picture, it is worthwhile keeping in mind that when we talk about monosynaptic stretch reflexes and that sort of thing, they are not really monosynaptic. There are a number of inputs on these things, not the least of which are descending pathways, which can really control the amount of of activity, the amount of sensitivity of the spindles themselves, but not only that, but of all the interneurons and all of the synapses back at the level of the spinal cord. So again, this is not a monosynaptic loop. This is a heterosynaptic loop, if you will. Okay, sometimes it's called oligosynaptic. The ideas of convergence and divergence, again, this just goes back to the idea that, again, there are a number of inputs onto any one alpha motor neuron. You could say, in other words, there is a convergence of inputs onto the alpha motor neuron. So, for example, we've got, in this picture here on the left, if we see the black interneurons as inhibitory and the white as excitatory, just some of the things we've got inhibitory and excitatory inputs from descending tracks. We've got inhibitory from the 1A inhibitory interneuron from the muscle from the opposite side, so the antagonistic muscle. We've got 1A excitation and group 2 excitation from the same muscle through the muscle spindles. We've got 1B inhibition from the Golgi tendon organ. We've got inhibition from the Renshaw cells. So there's a lot of inputs onto any given motor unit. And then there's the idea of divergence as well. And the divergence is just the idea that in this case, one interneuron influences a whole lot of different alpha motor neurons. Okay, that's divergence. That's all we need to say. Here, I think this is where we're going to end. I think this is the last piece we're going to talk about is understanding EMG signals. We can't really talk about myokinetics and kinematics without a quick discussion about EMG. And like I said at the outset of this talk, orthopedic physical therapy is becoming the realm of neurophysiology. You look at all the studies nowadays, and we're looking at EMG studies. We're looking at activation patterns and timing and all this sort of thing. And so we need to understand a little bit, at least, what EMG signals tell us and what they mean and how they're analyzed if we want to be able to read this literature and read it critically. So first of all, I'm going to show you two different types of EMG recordings. The top trace here is from an intramuscular recording. Intramuscularly, we get a lot less noise. In an intramuscular EMG recording, the recording needle, recording wire, is inserted directly into the muscle, usually through a needle, and is embedded in the muscle. And then the patient or the subject is asked to perform some movement, and we record the activity in that muscle. The nice thing about intramuscular recordings is that you can get individual motor units turning on, and you can record what's happening with those motor units. You can't do that so much with surface EMG. You get a lot more noise with the surface EMG. So in the top trace is an intramuscular EMG. All of the black dots are denoting one particular motor unit that's being recruited. So what we see here is there's sort of a baseline noise in this intramuscular recording, but there are a number of these spikes, these tall spikes. And that's one single motor unit. A motor unit, we'll remember, is one alpha motor neuron and all of the muscle fibers that it innervates. Okay? So we can look at the activity of one individual motor unit. On the other hand, we can look at the activity of a number of motor units with surface EMG. So that's the bottom trace. This is taken from, well, the top trace is taken from a paper by Rod Gosson and Jane Garland. And the bottom trace is taken from a paper by, well, included Paul Hodges, looking at the activation patterns of VMO and vastus lateralis in people with patellofemoral pain. In this case, showing that people with the patellofemoral pain, vastus lateralis was coming on before vastus medialis. But as you can see, the trace in the bottom trace, we don't see individual motor units. We see sort of a global feel or a global sense of how the muscle is being activated. So what do we do with those types of traces? How do we define them? Well, we can talk about, if we've got individual motor units, we can talk about the frequency of motor unit activation, and that's just a number of activations per time. We can count all of those black dots over a given time. We can talk about the number of motor units active, so oftentimes we can record more than one unit. We can talk about timing of activation, and that's what I showed you with the vastus lateralis versus VMO. And we can talk about the amplitude of the EMG signal. And that's one of the more interesting ones. Unfortunately, the amplitude of the signal is difficult to get sometimes because we have both positive and negative inflections in EMG. If we were to just summate those, the overall amplitude would come out to be, roughly 0, right? For every positive, we have a negative, and what's our amplitude? it would seem easy to just, measure from the highest peak of the positive to the lowest peak of the negative, but, researchers don't like to be easy. Actually, they feel that this really doesn't give us a true feeling of amplitude. So EMG signals can either be rectified, or we can look at the root mean square, which is RMS, of the EMG signal. And I'm just going to show you quickly what this means. These are two traces of rectified EMG. This process of rectification essentially takes all negative inflections and inverts them, so all we're left with are positive inflections of EMG. There's no negative left anymore. Oftentimes, we're going to get a trace around that signal, so we can look at, say, the highest peak amplitude, or we can look at the area under that curve for a given time, or something like that. So that gives us an idea of amplitude of EMG through rectification. This is just a method of analyzing EMG. When you see it in a paper, you can have an idea of what it's talking about. Root mean square, on the other hand, is, before I get to this slide here, root mean square is a process of taking all of the amplitudes of all EMG signal, squaring it. By squaring it, of course, all of the negative inflections again become positive. Taking an average of those amplitudes over a given time, or a mean, and then getting the square root of that average. So root mean square. Okay, square all of the EMG, take an average of amplitude over a given time, and then take the square root of it, and you get basically an average amplitude. Okay. So again, when you see that in a paper, at least you know what you're talking about. The H-reflex is becoming rather popular in manipulation literature, particularly from the chiropractors. I think it's worthwhile talking about what the H-reflex tells us, and I think we'll finish here. The H-reflex is essentially an overall indicator of motor neuron pool excitability. It can be thought of as an electrically induced tendon tap. It's essentially looking at that monosynaptic reflex, but through electrical stimulation of the nerve rather than tapping the tendon. By tapping the tendon, we remove the influence of the muscle spindle. Now, in order to get a good H-reflex, there are a couple of sort of criteria here. You need a muscle that is close to the surface so that you can record it, because most of these are recorded with surface EMG, although they can be recorded intramuscularly. You need a muscle that has a nerve that's superficial enough that it can be stimulated with a superficial stimulator, and also a nerve that is accessible at a distance from the muscle, as well as at a distance from the spinal cord. So anytime I see a paper talking about the H-reflex of paraspinal muscles, for example, I really have to question the methodology there, because I don't know how, and I studied the H-reflex for a long time, I don't know how to get a good H-reflex from a paraspinal muscle. Or even I've seen them done in the trapezius. I have a hard. I think there's a lot of potential for bad findings with that. So most often we're looking at muscles that are at a distance. So we're looking at extremity muscles. So the soleus in particular is oftentimes evaluated, and some of the hand muscles, the forearm muscles, can sometimes be evaluated as well. The H-reflex essentially involves a stimulator and an EMG recorder. The stimulator will stimulate the nerve. So again, I'll use the soleus as an example, although this is clearly a picture of an elbow. But in the soleus, we would stimulate the tibial nerve in the popliteal fossa. The EMG would be over the soleus. And what we're going to get here, when we stimulate this nerve, we get two things happening. We get a direct stimulation of the alpha motor neuron, okay, because it travels within that nerve. So we're going to get a direct stimulation of the soleus. We're also going to get the reflex loop, because we're also going to stimulate the afferent fibers that also travel in that nerve. Remember, within one single nerve, there are both afferent and efferent fibers. There are also autonomic fibers oftentimes. So we're going to stimulate both the motor and the sensory fibers lying within that nerve. The motor fibers will go directly to the muscle. The sensory fibers are going to go first back up to the spinal cord, synapse onto the alpha motor neuron, and then go back to the muscle. When we record the EMG, we can see that. We see two different waves. we see what's called the M wave. The M wave is the direct stimulation of that muscle, and it occurs within milliseconds of stimulation. And then we get the H reflex. The H reflex is that stimulus that stimulated the sensory, the afferent fiber. So the 1A fiber, for example, went up to the spinal cord, synapsed on the alpha motor neuron, and back down to the muscle. Now this particular image here is taken from one of my papers. Shows what happens from a pre-fatigue state to a post-fatigue state in people as we have them fatigue their soleus muscle. This is what the H reflex can tell us. In the presence of a stable M wave, we can say that, well, the direct stimulation of the muscle hasn't changed. So in other words, the stimulator is still in the same place. We're still getting the same neural stimulation. The EMG recordings haven't changed. Okay, so the M wave sort of serves as a control, if you will. The H reflex has changed. Now this is interesting because, look, what we're seeing here, we did this study looking at mechanisms of fatigue. We still get a fairly consistent M wave. The muscle itself can still contract, but that reflex, the excitability of that motor neuron is drastically decreased. So this could be talking about, we could be talking about mechanisms of fatigue here, and again, that would be a whole other talk. But if we see decrease in excitation of the alpha motor neuron, if we see a decreased H reflex, then we can assume that the tone of the muscle has decreased. So again, in the chiropractic literature in particular, looking at manipulation, what they're saying is you've got a hypertonic muscle, a spasmy muscle. You do a manipulation at the level that supplies that muscle, and then you can decrease the excitation of the motor neuron going to that muscle, and that's how we affect a decrease in muscle tone and spasm and pain and what have you. That's a hypothesis. I look forward to seeing more work in the area. Because I think it makes sense in a way. I'm not sure that manipulation has that big of an effect, but I can imagine it does. The H reflex is a very, very labile thing. What I mean by that is it can be affected by ambient light. It can be affected by head position, smoking, noise, all these sorts of things. So it's, this is interesting because, again, this is an electrically evoked tendon tap. We've taken out the influence of muscle spindles. So in other words, we've taken out the influence of gamma gain, if you will, from that monosynaptic reflex, and even still, that reflex can be affected by these things. This is why I think that we need to be careful with our interpretation of tendon tap reflexes, deep tendon reflexes. They should be fairly labile. They should change over time because, never on two different occasions are we going to get the exact same environmental conditions. There's studies looking at the difference in the H reflex between morning and night. Again, if you take your H reflex stimulation greater than every 5 seconds, it starts to decrease. Same thing if you tap your tendon more than every 5 seconds, you might expect it to decrease. So this literature is interesting, if nothing else, from that standpoint, that deep tendon reflexes are quite labile things. So I think for my closing thoughts, hopefully you can understand how a good understanding of neurophysiology, and really I focused on the periphery here, can influence the types of treatments that you choose, the types of exercises that you choose to do, and hopefully by understanding these mechanisms, you're going to be able to reason and problem solve through really any case that you come up against, no matter how challenging it is, if you can understand the basic mechanisms behind it. So, many thanks. This is a picture of me at Christmas 2005. I don't have that hair anymore. I started looking a bit too much like my own greasy uncle and decided to cut it off, and I've got much less now. Now it's one of those do's that, takes half an hour to make it look like you did nothing with it. Anyway, if you ever have any comments or questions for me regarding this information, I can be reached at my email address, which is dwalton5, DWALTON5, @uwo.ca.